Well, it's my pleasure to open up the conference with this first panel of three, and the first three interventions on choice architecture. Let me briefly introduce the panelists on this panel. I'll start with Sabrina Artinger to my left. She's a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin in the illustrious ABC group, the Center for Adaptive Behavior and Cognition, and at the University of Oxford Entrepreneurship Center. Her research focuses on judgment and decision-making, and more particularly on the influence of context and choice environments. She's associated with numerous prestigious academic institutions, naming all of which would delay the further proceedings too much, so please allow me to refer you to the conference folder. Gebhard Kirchgässner, to my right, really does not need any introduction here. He's one of the patrons of new political economy in Europe, and his book, Homo economicus, is the standard reference for anyone interested in the behavioral model or in the economic model of human behavior. It has exerted great influence in the field of law and economics in Europe. And let me just mention that he's a Professor Emeritus of Economics and Econometrics and former director of the Swiss Institute for International Economics and Applied Economic Research at the University of St. Gallen, and a member of the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. His research focuses on new political economy, applied econometrics, and methodological principles of the social sciences. And then to the far right, from my perspective, is Benedikt Herrmann. He's the team leader of the behavioral economics team of the Institute for Health and Consumer Protection of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. With an education both in natural sciences and economics, Benedikt has published widely in leading journals of various fields. His groundbreaking experiments with the voluntary contribution mechanism and the insights and questions regarding cooperative behavior across cultures, as well as the questions derived from them, have kept entire working groups busy for quite a while. And trust me, I know what I'm talking about. My name, finally, is Emanuel Towfigh. I'm a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods in Bonn. The inspiring keynote lecture yesterday has already shown that one of the most central talking points regarding choice architectures or nudging revolves around the question of its legitimacy. And this will be the point of the departure for this panel to get our debate in this conference started. Just let me give you a brief idea of the thread that will go through the panelists' interventions. They all depart from the notion that it is impossible to have choice architecture-free regulation. As Gebhard Kirchgässner and Sabrina Artinger will show, we introduce choice architectures the very moment that we use the law to influence societal processes. Law aimed at governing, steering, regulating behavior, and issues of legitimacy in this context can occur on two levels. We can question the ends, the objectives of choice architectures, and we can question the means employed to influence citizens' choices. On the level of the end, Gebhard Kirchgässner will argue that legitimacy of choice architectures may well depend on our interpretation of nudges. Are they a form of state-centered paternalism, implying a social planner or a benevolent dictator? Or can they be understood as a form of collective self-binding through the political process? On the level of the means, Sabrina Artinger will ponder on the difference of information and education on the one hand, and of framing and default setting on the other hand. This, she argues, may relate to notions of autonomy or manipulation, the other big word we've heard yesterday. Against this backdrop, then, Benedikt Herrmann will give us a hands-on political perspective on choice architectures. He'll ask what are the behavioral approaches the European Commission considers, in a sense. What are, from a political perspective, limits to nudging and to choice architectures? and he'll talk about the necessities of political control of state-driven intervention. So without much further ado, let me welcome Gebhard Kirchgässner to the floor.
Jetzt mit den Folien.
You have the slides?
So. Okay. Okay, let me start. Meantime, I'll speak about paternalism. Okay, thanks. Okay, hard to see here. Okay.
Do you prefer to?
Bitte?
Würden Sie lieber am Pult?
Naja, aber man sieht das überhaupt nicht.
Nee,
das Licht muss weg da. Okay. Ja. Okay, I'll speak about paternalism, but not about GPS. That's totally irrelevant for me. Not about reminder of paying a bill. I doubt whether this is really a nudge if I have to pay 10 Swiss francs for this reminder and all these things. Being in the economic tradition, I speak about government intervention or intervention of other authorities and not about private behavior that I buy a GPS to help me. I think this deviates from the really crucial points. In contrast to traditional measures of hard paternalism, and paternalism is omnipresent in our societies, libertarian paternalism, or as I say, soft paternalism, intends not to restrict the freedom of choice. Nudges are nevertheless measures of paternalism, and therefore subject to the same critiques as measures of hard paternalism. And I'll, in the following, present three theses. No? Okay. First, even employing soft incentives like nudges, which do not, at least in principle, impair the freedom of decision of the individuals affected, soft or libertarian paternalism faces the identical problem as any other kind of paternalism. What justifies government interventions in individuals' decisions if no interests of third parties are involved? The only possibility, as I see it, for such a justification available so far is the idea of collective self-binding as proposed by Brennan and Lomaski. Political interventions into the market process are usually justified by existence of external effects and or public goods. Here, rights and interests of third parties are crucial. The goal is to compensate positive as well as negative effects of legitimate individual actions on uninvolved third parties. In contrast to these, the rights and interests of third parties are not at the core of paternalistic measures. Their objective is to help citizens to make decisions that are in their own best interest. To influence individuals contrary to their own preferences is, at least as a first glance, in contradiction to the traditional vision of normative individualism, which is predominant in our societies since the period of Enlightenment. According to this concept, the values of autonomous individuals are the only ones that should be relevant in society, and nobody has the right to prescribe others which values to accept. This concept is also behind the traditional normative economics, for example, welfare economics. Thus, there has been strong criticism of paternalism by economists and philosophers, most prominently by John Stuart Mill, but also recently by economists regarding to libertarian paternalism. However, paternalism does not necessarily have to be seen in contradiction to this normative concept as soon as, following the philosophical tradition, we accept that human persons are able to reflect their own behavior. According to Harry G. Frankfurt, this is a precondition for a human being to be considered being a person. In economic terminology, this implies that individuals possess hierarchically ordered preferences functions. They are able to evaluate their short-run preference, with their superordinated reflexive or long-run preferences. Conflicts between these two kinds of preferences can cause the well-known problem of weakness of will. To take account of this, we might do self-binding measures to prevent us to act in specific situations according to our short-run preferences in order to be more in line with the long-run preferences. Paternalistic political measures can be understood as collective self-bindings via the political process. Take as an example our Swiss old age pension system. Its first column, the old age and survivors insurance, is intended to secure the culturally determined subsistence level. This can be justified to avoid external effects whenever individuals fail to insure themselves and therefore others have to pay their pensions. The second column, the occupational pension, is intended to allow old citizens to maintain their previous standard of living. It is mandatory, but this can hardly be justified by reference to external effects. Nevertheless, Swiss people decided in the referendum of December 3, 1972, with 74% to introduce this pension system on a mandatory basis. Following Brennan and Lomaski, this can be interpreted as a measure of collective self-binding. Insofar, it is not incompatible with the principle of normative individualism. Thus, even if it is impossible to justify all paternalistic measures that are installed today, a general rejection of every paternalism due to its incompatibility with liberal principles is no longer possible. Second thesis. To motivate individuals to extend their contribution to old age pensions, soft incentives can be effective and do hardly lead to moral problems. Applying such incentives in healthcare, the picture is quite different. Measures proposed so far to fight obesity do not seem to lead to any moral problems, but are mostly not effective. Measures to increase the readiness for organ donations might be very effective, but can be afflicted with serious moral problems. A whole series of policy measures have been proposed within the nudge framework. They relate mainly to retirement provisions and to the health system. Among the latter, mainly problems of obesity, smoking, and organ donations are tackled. The measures proposed often present a particular alternative as status quo that a particular point of view evaluates as being preferable. There is no problem to deviate from this default solution, but it demands an active decision. Even if their long-run effects are smaller than their short-run ones, measures relating to retirement provisions are feasible and seem to be effective. The experiments with the 401k pension plans are convincing. The situation is quite different, however, with respect to healthcare. Obesity is increasingly a societal problem in Europe, but in particular in the United States, where the share of obese people has increased quite a lot during recent decades. A possibility to reduce the consumption of fatty foods might be to arrange food products in supermarkets in such a way that low-calorie foods are easily accessed, while high-calorie foods are less accessible. This is particularly important for foods primarily attractive for children. From the marketing literature, we know that the arrangement of products in the store or supermarket has an impact on sales. This opens a possibility to exert influence. It is open, however, how the owners of these shops are ready to do this. They might arrange their goods so as to maximize their profits. If the government prescribes such an arrangement, it's hardly possible to speak of soft paternalism, leaving aside the fact that this would create a huge control problem. To change the organ donation from the consent to the objection rule can considerably increase the number of organs available for transplants. However, this rule implies serious moral problems because an extraction of an organ implies an invasion into the integrity of a human person, even if this person is already dead. According to our, at least today, prevailing moral convictions, Such an invasion, absent the consent of the person involved, should only be allowed under very restrictive conditions. Whether the fact that the life of another person can be prolonged is sufficient for this is contested. Thus, soft paternalistic measures might be not as innocuous as might be perceived at a first glance. Third thesis. We cannot escape these problems by abstaining from all paternalistic measures, as some critiques of soft paternalism suggest, and/or just maintaining the status quo. As soon as it is realized that a given status quo has an impact on the individual's decisions, and as far as a default option is subject to political decisions, one has to decide which default option to choose, and this choice has to be justified. Insofar, we are necessarily confronted with choosing default options and therefore with applying measures of soft paternalism. Their usage should, of course, be justified by democratic means. Some fundamentalist economic critiques of soft paternalism insinuate an, in their opinion, ideal world without any paternalism. Such a radical anti-paternalism can be traced back to John Stuart Mill and is today mainly represented by some constitutional economists. In contrast to the philosophical tradition, some of these economists also postulate the priority of the short run over the long run preferences. As mentioned above, we are living in a world in which paternalism is omnipresent. Second, such a radical anti-paternalism would hardly make sense. It would, for example, imply the abolition of nearly all labor safety laws. And finally, it can presumably not be realized. This holds at least for democratic political system, and it becomes quite obvious in the Swiss democratic system, where many paternalistic measures are politically legitimized by referenda. There is also another reason why radical anti-paternalism is hardly possible. As soon as it is realized that the way information is presented influences the individual's decisions, the question how information should be presented has to be answered. Whether the default option has an impact, whenever the default option has an impact, the government or the respective firm influences the citizens or employees providing the normal situation. The same holds whenever behavior depends on the frame used. In these situations, one should consider which frame to choose or which default option should be proposed. Closing one's eyes to this fact and just continuing what has been done before might hardly be a rational strategy. Moreover, in these situations, the argument, dubious also for other reasons, does not hold that the short-run preferences should have more weight than the long-run ones. Depending on the default options, the individuals seem to have different short-run preference functions, or the same short-run preference function leads to different results depending on the default option. Thus, referring only to the short-run preferences does not make it possible to say which solution is better and which one is worse. The short-run preference function does not imply criteria for this decision. On the other hand, whenever such a conflict exists between short-run preference functions, it makes sense to refer to the long-run preferences. Critiques of soft paternalism often state that there exists no omniscient actor who knows the true preferences of the individuals, which would be a precondition for responsible applications of soft paternalistic measures. Thus, it is often not taken into account that in democratic systems, decisions about introducing such measures are not taken by a central planner, but in the direct democratic system by the citizens themselves, or in the representative system by their representatives. If one accepts the democratic principle, the question is whether the citizens approve a policy and not whether it is compatible with a particular ideology. The latter might be an argument in the public discussion, but if a majority of citizens demands the introduction of mechanisms of collective self-binding, this cannot prohibit it in a democracy. In a democratic system, deciding which rules are to be followed is the task of the citizens or the representatives and not the one of others. It is, moreover, highly debatable whether it would really be an advantage to not longer decide for ourselves about the organization of political processes and instead to allocate this task to some economists who insinuate that all others only maximize their own utility while they themselves behave like a benevolent dictator intending to maximize social welfare. Compared to this pretension, soft paternalism is rather moderate, even it can and should be rightly criticized. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sabrina.
Okay, pointer, please. Thank you. Does the microphone work? Yeah, excellent. So, I have been nudged, and I'm thankful for that nudge. Let me tell you what happened. A little while ago, I moved to the UK, starting my first job after my PhD. I was excited and a little bit nervous, and in my first days, I was very busy to solve all kinds of administrative issues, like finding a house, opening a bank account, getting a national security number, and all things sorted. And there I was on the streets of Oxford, lost in my thoughts, trying to cross the street when it happened. I was just about to run into a large red bus when I saw this warning painted in big white letters on the pavement in front of me, reminding me to look right. That day, this nudge undoubtedly saved me from a very unpleasant encounter with British traffic. I was one dangerous foreigner on British streets trying to adjust to the left-hand traffic, but thanks to our large number, considerate administrators had decided to remind us of the direction in which to look when crossing a street. They had decided to nudge us. This example of a nudge shows very nicely that nudges can be helpful for the individual as well as for the society as a whole. It is also an uncontroversial example of a nudge. Most people will agree with the legitimacy of road markings. But today we are here because this does not undoubtedly account for all nudges and not for all situations in the same way. I therefore wish to contribute to the discussion about choice architecture by making 3 points. First of all, the idea of nudging is not new. For instance, the look right and look left traffic signs have been first established by the British Traffic Signs Regulation in December 1933. What is new is the justification for behavioral nudges as provided by Richard Saylor and Kees Sunstein. They argue that our decisions are systematically biased because our automatic responses are irreversibly flawed, and that we cannot be nudged because our automatic system is hardly able to learn. This proposition about human cognition lies at the very heart of the controversy about behavioral nudges. Not only do most people object to this image of the human mind, also scientific evidence for this proposition is disputable and far from being as clear-cut as often claimed. While a lot has been written and demonstrated about the persistence of cognitive biases, there's also ample evidence that our automatic responses can indeed learn. For instance, it took me only a couple of days to adapt to the left-hand traffic. Such training of the automatic system does not necessarily take a huge amount of time and effort. It is not a hopeless endeavor. Often, even rather small numbers of repetition can be sufficient. This brings me to my second point. The success of learning and training itself depends on choice environment, particularly on the feedback and information we are given. In order to learn and adapt, we need appropriate and clear feedback. We need transparent information. Back in Oxford, when I needed to adjust to left-hand traffic, the road markings on the pavement have surely supported my learning process by making me alert of the new environment and whenever I was about to cross the street. After a short time, I did not need to look at the road markings anymore, but they were useful tools in helping me to adapt. Unfortunately, there are choice environments that are intentionally or unintentionally designed to impede learning. One example is the case of hire purchase, where benefits and costs of a purchase are perceptually separated, and the cost of the purchase is spread in such a way that it is hard to perceive appropriately. Also, in many other environments, information is complex and intransparent, and feedback is distorted or lacking. If public policy makers aim to support educated choices, they need to understand both the factors that impede and the factors that promote learning. This lends support to a deliberate approach to choice architecture in a more differential and hopefully less controversial way. Thirdly and lastly, I'm missing something in this debate. What I'm missing is that choice architecture consists of a very broad spectrum of tools, from education and improving transparency to classic examples of nudges as making specific aspects of the choice problem salient or setting default options. These tools differ in the degree to which they empower and enable people to make educated choices. For instance, in 2011, the EU introduced a guideline to simplify and standardize the way information about property loans is presented by banks, to the effect that consumers can compare different credit offers more easily. Similarly, fact boxes, as published by the Bertelsmann Foundation and the Harding Center for Risk Literacy, provide patients with easy-to-understand information about the risks and chances of medical treatments and improves their ability to decide against or for a specific treatment. These tools aid personal freedom of choice. They are tools of empowerment. Default options, on the other hand, are powerful behavioral nudges that do not reduce individual freedom. But setting defaults does not improve the decision maker's ability to make educated choices either. The primary and most important tools for improving choice environments should therefore always be tools for empowerment that simplify processes and information and enhance transparency and clarity. Framing, prominence, and setting default options should only be used in addition to these tools in order to hedge against impetuous choice. They should not be used as surrogates for transparency or education. Against this background, we must be very careful about the argument of the cost-benefit efficiency of certain nudges. It might imply that low-cost nudges should be preferred to potentially more cost-intensive tools like education or information. If policymakers use choice architecture to simplify education and to aid learning, people are enabled to make better choices for themselves, and we can overcome the problem of the justification of choice architecture. Thank you.
Thanks. Benedikt.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks first of all to the organizer for inviting me. I'm a practitioner, so I'm a behavioral economist. I would say, incentive engineer, so not a choice architect, who is since 2011 working at the European Commission to provide input to policymakers regarding insights from the behavioral sciences on how people might respond to all kind of policies. And having this, I would like to start with a strong comment, kind of, the Commission almost doesn't nudge. So why is that? We are a supranational organization with our job description kind of to provide regulations, directive to member states, but the implementation, execution is up to them. So most part of the policies, the implementation and execution of policies where choice architecture and nudging generally becomes interesting, is not in our hands. There are few policy fields where we can do our self-directly kind of the execution. I'm very glad that we have with us Alexander Winterstein, who then afterwards will present specific cases where the Commission is kind of hands-on and has to think about whether or not to nudge. So before going to my own activities, I will quickly give you an overview so that you have a general picture of what is happening on European level, or at least at the level of the European Commission, with regard to taking behavioral insights generally to policy making. So it all started in 2008, thanks to a very active unit in General Directorate Sanco, so it's a General Directorate for Consumer Protection and Health Policies. They organized a big conference in Brussels 2008 on behavioral insights, nudging, and policy making. This became quite popular, so there were two follow-up conferences in 2010 and 2013. And the first conference has also been influential in that it triggered already the first big study. It was on financial literacy of the European Commission, an excellent study conducted by the colleagues from the London School of Economics, which then also partly led to this regulation that you quoted in 2011 on simplification. The study showed that basically financial literacy is shockingly low across Europe, and that there is need to do something on it. From this, I guess also from the success to this study, or the impressive outcome of this study, the desire came up to set up a large framework contract to commercial contractors that would provide the European Commission now since 2011 with insights from the behavioral sciences to all kinds of policies. And in this context, my position was created, or my team was created. Our job was at the beginning only to kind of advise the colleagues when they procure the contracts for these studies, to give them advice how to properly set it up. Now, I very quickly got involved in additional, as soon as I was established, I got a request, for instance, from the Task Force for Greece to help out in the background on how we can increase the quality of public administration in Greece from behavioral insights. And so I was lucky enough that I got 3 additional postdoc positions, 4 actually at the moment. And for now, we are working on issues like how to increase tax compliance across Europe, how to get people to become physically more active, to fight obesity, how to get rid of overconsumption of alcohol. And what I'm saying here today is a kind of a status quo reflection of what I learned so far from this. Let me start first with our expectation on nudging and taking generally behavioral insights to policymaking. I'm afraid to say so that the expectations that meanwhile raised in the public are a little bit too high. I hope I'm not talking off my head now, but it is really, we have to consider, it has been a little bit sideline already noted, that nudges, if they are powerful, this is an important finding of the last, I would say, 24 months, is they're powerful, there is the threat that they have side effects, which at first glance you don't look at. For example, a nice research work has recently conducted in the UK showing that a certain incentive structure to get people to do more physical sport, physical activity, to do more sport, unexpectedly leads then afterwards that they eat more junk food. You might we have in our research, we found one setting where reminding of your social responsibility to your loved ones got the one subject pool to significantly increase the behavioral change to the way you would like to have it, or as a public policymaker, as a social planner, if I may say so in this context. Then we were very excited, and then we went to another subject pool and tested it again in a randomized field trial, and damn it went in the other direction. It went down. So it would exactly do the opposite. So this is the second important point. Apart from unexpected side effects, which might not in the intention of the policymaker, you have also the issue of, particularly if you talk European policymaking, there's something which might work, say, in the north of Europe, in the social cultural setting that you have in north of Europe, might have the opposite effect in the south of the east. You never know. So this is... and then finally, of course, this issue of to what extent it's really the effect of a non-incentive, non-legislation, also non-fine-based intervention. Is it really sustainable? And here, if you don't mind, might raise here publicly a little bit critique on what the Behavioral Insights team has delivered. You might have heard in the last years they once did an intervention to get people to pay back faster their tax debts. Now they did a one-shot randomized field trial and tested it and came out with a positive finding. Well, and then from then on now they're using it regularly. There was no follow-up testing. Somebody myself who is into social norms, so this intervention was based on social norms, so would also appeal that, look, the majority in your social environment has done it already. For my own research, I would be a little bit suspicious whether this might not have this constant appeal to the social norm, might have, again, maybe a negative side effect, namely in the erosion, in the long-term erosion of the social norm, or that people just don't care anymore about it, get down. So this is a little bit... So having said this, I don't want now to be kind of quoted as saying, Mr. Herrmann is saying, nudges and behavioral insights are worse. No, of course not. But we just have to, being subject ourselves to behavioral failures, we are also humans, we should do proper expectation management and be aware that it's not the miraculous silver bullet that allows us by no additional tax burden, ideal welfare state, by no kind of legislative intervention, to change people's behavior sustainably in a certain direction, exactly the way we want to have it. And before I finish my statement, I would like also a little bit come forward with a reflection on the history of this discussion of nudging and the success of nudging. It has evolved basically in the specific institutional environment of the United Kingdom, which is, if I'm not mistaken, you are the expert as the lawyer, but I was told by somebody that the UK is basically a dictatorship elected for 4 years. And it's not to me to judge that, this is what I was told. But what definitely is the case is like in the context of the UK, where you have still a very centralized government. So it's impressive what kind is decided in London, which is not the case in any other European country. So in this very centralized context, where you can kind of pull the line in London and then dong up to Aberdeen, it would be implemented. Here in this context, it's very, or further north, I'm hopefully not getting it. Here in this context, it might be very fruitful to think about how we optimize the execution, taking the behavioral insights into, and also something what is decided in Downing Street 10, maybe my perception of the UK is too naive, but my perception very much was it's decided in Downing Street 10, very much gets implemented away in the Parliament as a legislative draft and then later executed. Well, how is the reality in the rest of Europe? And if I may say now on the European level, if we, the Commission, would come up with a perfectly behavioral science-based draft regulation, it goes first to the European Parliament. We don't have the European Parliament. Not only do we have political parties, we have also national interests. So we have hundreds, thousands of amendments. And then this draft goes to the European Council. Again, we have the combination, a unique European thing. We have the combination of political interests, but also very strong national interests, historically, with their own centuries of traditions. At the end, what comes to be implemented in the member states is far away, in most cases, quite different from what we as the Commission have started with. Having said this, again, I think it's not so easy to kind of get valuable behavioral insight to being implemented. And then finally, and this is where then was kind of why my team is working now a lot with member states, is we have to state at the European level, execution is of course in the hands of the member states, the execution of our directives, regulations, so on. And that's why, and at the execution, it's basically where all this issue of nudging, of choice architecture, of taking behavioral insights comes into game, because it's about the little tiny details. A minor change in detail can have a tremendous effect potentially. And that's why we do now direct work with the member states, getting involved academic scholars across Europe, trying, of course, to do a kind of a sophisticated learning on what is actually the best way forward to implement the policy. And then in this context, very fast comment, I would like to stress very much what has been said by my previous speakers and also by Sunstein. Yes, I'm very well. Well, I think we shouldn't be too much worried about nudging or whatever, other taking behavioral insights on board for policymaking. What is only just key to it, transparency. If you talk the other two forms of changing citizens' behavior, that is taxes, and the other is kind of fining or by legislation, then these are they are tough, they're rude, but they're very honest. You can read, you are chased by the tax authorities on your taxes, you are chased by the police if you commit something against the existing rules. They're transparent, honest. Nudges, because they're so subtle, they don't feel so strongly. So the more, I think, is very important to have a transparent, public, continuous monitoring, observation, discussion of the implementation of findings on behavioral sciences to possible policy applications. I think it's absolutely, I would even consider something like if you get a certain invitation or you are nudged by the public authorities in a certain way, that there should be a kind of disclaimer footnote, you have been nudged here according to bang. So having said this, thanks a lot for your attention, and let's go to the discussion.
Well, in thanking the three panelists, let me open the floor for discussion, and let me also invite our long-distance discussants online. Please. Yes.
I'm from TU Dresden, and I want to ask Benedikt Herrmann, when we think in a comparative perspective, it's always emphasized in a comparative perspective, there's always the emphasis that we are speaking of worlds of welfare systems or welfare institutions that differ across countries. And I had the questions whether you have the experience in Brussels that there is some kind of worlds of opposition or approval of nudging policies within the EU. Are there countries or administrations that are more in favor of it? You mentioned the case of the UK, of course, but I would be interested about the rest of the countries there or the administrative bureaucracies that somehow reflected within this process in Brussels.
No, also here I can say that the idea to take now behavioral insights on board is very appealing to anyone. I mean, I'm not aware of any specific member state representative, be it within the Commission, or also in the Commission we don't have a member states representative, as we are all part of the Commission, but say of the Parliament or the Council. I haven't come across ever particular country-specific, culture kind of critique-specific background relating to the culture background. No, I think there's at the moment really it's a warm welcoming because it's of course really it's promising. And I mean what. And Sunstein did very nice case yesterday for the. I mean, if you talk to, for example, simplification. I mean, who will oppose simplification? I mean, this person has to be firstly invented. I mean, this is something very common to anyone. This is at least as a lip service. The other thing is what then happens in reality. But these are very, I think, very popular and demand. So no, there's nothing what I could state on that there would be a difference across member states' background.
Yeah, please.
My name is Philip Hacker. I'm from the Humboldt University, from the law school. Thanks, first of all, for your inspiring interventions. I have a particular question to Sabrina. You nicely pointed out sort of the richness of the empirical data and the controversial nature that is inherent in it. You talked mostly about the heuristics and biases literature and how some of the results are disputed, and then talked about learning. For as much as I know, the behavioral insights on learning and debiasing, for example, are equally disputable. For example, if we look at the literature on direct warnings for debiasing, Loewenstein and Babcock found in 1997 that the self-serving bias cannot be debiased by direct warnings, but then Albert Reifer, for example, found in 1982 that overconfidence can. So I was wondering whether that same critique sort of applies to your approach and whether it wouldn't be more rational to think about it in terms of sort of dealing with uncertainty in a legal environment when we are discussing those matters, both on the biases and on the learning front.
Thank you for the question. As you just pointed out correctly, both of these approaches are disputed, and I think that if we want to approach these issues, we should look at each and every case separately and individually. As you said, for some cases, debiasing works. For some cases, if you just make slight changes in the choice environment, you find that biases might go away. And in a lot of these cases, we can also show that people are actually able to learn. For instance, conditional probabilities, that's one of the examples that is very often used, that people have a very hard time to understand what it actually means. So there's a huge program trying to teach different groups of people, including school children, how to understand conditional probabilities better. And these show that even third graders can do it if taught appropriately. So I think we shouldn't give up on education so soon and should rather try and really well understand those characteristics of the environment that we can change in order to hedge against these biases, and that we can also alter in terms of improving the learning process itself. And I think there's lots of work to do. Probably you're involved in that work too, and I hope we will learn a lot more about this discussion in the years to come.
Yes, Christopher.
Max Müller-Herlin from the Ministry of Research and Education. I would like to comment on what you said, Mr. Herrmann. I think you underestimate the power of the Commission concerning nudging. Or I'm wrong with the notion of nudging, perhaps, because agricultural subsidies have shaped what agriculture means in Europe. Horizon 2020 shapes what excellence and research means in Europe, and regional funding has defined our notion of regions itself and how they should be developed. Thank you.
Maybe we have a bilateral discussion afterwards, because not that you think there's anything to hide. Well, if you want, I think there are many other questions, but a quick one. I mean, what you are referring to are those topics where it's about European budget, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's about allocating of grants, and I mean here, in that respect, there is, of course, actually it's an interesting thought too. I mean, if there would be more kind of deeper going reflection on actually how do this is actually an interesting thought, indeed, how the way we allocate the grants impacts the actors' behavior. This might be quite interesting. It's true that I think there is not such a. It's more about in the political fight that we are. This is more for the member states now to blame. It's more about who gets how much, and then once it's settled how much goes to certain groups, then how we allocate the grants is not anymore so it's the issue. Interesting thought, true. And what I would say, I mean, here the discussion, what I understood here today, is more about really laws and regulations, less about grants allocation and how do then the different agents respond to that, but more about how we set regulations, regulatory framework, so kind of when it's not about getting money from the state directly. So in that respect, I think I think I'm still correct with the statement that in that respect, your Commission, when it comes to the implementation of regulation, it's to the member states in most places.
Christoph Engel.
My comment is triggered by the concluding remarks by Benedikt Herrmann. And I think he pushes us into an intriguing but difficult to tackle problem. If we look at classic intervention, be it you forbid something or be it you hand out some money, it is totally clear who has done it. Maybe you can reconstruct the intentions. Often the intentions are outspoken. If you don't like it, you can take them to court. Now, how can we transpose this kind of democratic cleanliness to nudges if Kesansin was right yesterday, and I think he was, in saying there is no such thing as a nudge-free world. So if we don't do anything, we have other nudges at work. The dogmatic, legally speaking, or doctrinal questions are intriguing here. One way would be to say everything that we can show has an effect of governance and is in any way related to government action is an intervention in constitutional terms. And probably this is the best way to go at the end of the day. But it means that the Constitutional Court gets a lot of work. The alternative option would be that we now care about explicit intentions and say it only counts as intervention if not only we can show that it has an effect, but if we can also show that government intended this effect. But if you are a good political economist, you know what will happen. They will never talk about intentions, but they will, of course, have them. In which ways can we transpose this, to repeat the term, democratic cleanliness that is well established with direct intervention into these forms of more subtle intervention? And I think we should discuss that intensely, because if we don't have it, we lose the legitimacy coming from the fact that there is at least a potential outside control of what's going on.
Just, kannst du jetzt bitte nichts? Ja. Also das mach das jetzt. Ich mache jetzt einen kurzen Statement, aber da kein Kommentar ins Netz, ja? Bitte. No, I have certainly. So I think there is one funny finding from behavioral economists, which I may raise a little bit. This is, most of us love to influence others, be it positive or be it badly. We have, and many of us have an intrinsic drive to, and policymakers, I think in particular. Having said this, and I think that's why it was my appeal that for this constant need and particular need for transparency and scrutiny by the public, 95%, this is all good intention, and most 99% of all these behavior-based interventions, they're also clean in effect and so on. When it turns what Kirchgässner yesterday referred to, the element of manipulation that could pop up. It's not, I haven't come across anything like that. But if there was an element of manipulation, and then there might be the drive of the policymakers, because exactly for this, I want to influence somebody. I have this pleasure. This, I think, is particular. This has its own kind of behavioral logic, nature. The policymaker is also subject to a behavioral nature. And I think in that respect, it's particularly important that there would be, again, only the call for really maximum of transparency and discussion on that, what has happened, why it has happened. Can only reiterate it.
Yes, Herr Wagner.
I want to come back to a point that we already discussed yesterday. The longer we talk about these different policy fields, the impression that gets stronger on me is that we're talking actually about two different concepts. One is actually nudging as a policy tool, and it seems obvious that you can use nudges not only for the purpose of improving the decisions of the people who are nudged in their own long-term interest, but also for any other policy objective. You might fight tax evasion with the help of nudges instead of throwing people into prison. I mean, that is not libertarian paternalism, I guess, but it's still nudging, and then it's a milder form of intervention. Rather than prosecuting people, you can nudge them so to avoid crime. But deterrence is the common goal then, and that has nothing to do with paternalism in a technical sense. It's just a kind of law enforcement in a more subtle and maybe more efficient way. May work, may not work, empirical question, depends on the context, depends on what you, whether, how you do it, but it's just a policy tool, it seems to me. And then there are other cases where the question is whether you intervene in the interest of the people who are nudged, and then the comparison is not criminal law or whatever, it's just doing nothing. And then I think that it's hard to dispute that the government is changing the rules of society or of the market rather than leaving it alone. And
in the middle of the invitation, it was presented like this. As no, it's here. Note that the restaurant is vegetarian only. If you want a side dish, please let me know. Of course, that is a kind of nudge, and this nudge was presented more open in the beginning page. There's this, since the selected is nudging you to vegetarian diet, but not vegetarian only, please inform us if you wish to have a meat side dish for the dinner. And then I noted it's a nudge. They wanted to nudge me to have a vegetarian diet, and I just said I don't want to be nudged in that respect. And I wanted to opt out, but there was no box I could tick so for that reason. So I left it. So there are some nudges for which transparency is just counter-effective. And that's my main objection against the concept of nudging. It's a very broad concept. It covers a wide range of regulatory modes, from default rules to pre-commitment strategies, which all maybe have to be regarded separately. They all pose different problems. They all pose different legal problems. They all pose different problems for autonomy. They all pose different problems for concerning the presumed effect of them. And, well, that's my main objection, just.
Thank you for your comment, if I might answer. I think the point you just mentioned is exactly the point I wanted to make, that the broad variety of tools that we have in this toolbox of choice architecture is very diverse, and we are far from being at a point where we have discussed enough and understood well enough how each of them works and how we should deal with each of them, or even with a combination of specific nudges altogether. The idea that I wanted to transport here is that empowerment is one of those dimensions that we should care for if considering these different tools in the choice architecture toolbox, and that according to our idea of autonomy or an autonomous citizen, we should first care about allowing an educated choice, so using tools that improve the educated choice first. There are also nudges, like classic nudges, that can achieve this aim, and only nudge with more typical examples of nudges like default options as a measure of last resort, so to say. I'm not against doing this. I'm just making the point that whenever you use it, you should first make sure that people were well informed and that they were well educated, so you can actually account or can actually be sure that they can make this choice for themselves and don't have to rely on us to give him an appropriate default option, if that answers your question. And I think there's again a lot of discussion still to be done and a lot of thinking to be done yet, and we should be all very much aware of where we are in this discussion. And I think Kestansin yesterday also showed, he showed us the broad variety of the tools that are available, and also from this discussion I understood that you're also thinking about these issues a lot and develop these issues further. So I hope this is, or I'm pretty sure this will be a very interesting discussion that we will have in the next years about these topics.
You want to add?
May I quickly on the transparency? My point of view would be simply transparency is a conditio sine non quo, or whatever. You are the proper Latino, so no, this was the bad one. But anyway, so this has to be done. And I think it's worthwhile to incur the cost that some nudges might not work. It's like if I'm a researcher, whether I like it or not, and I'm researching human behavior, I have to submit my proposal to the ethics committee. And some of the proposals might get lost on it, might be rejected. But at the end of the day, it's, I think, for all of us better that there are these ethics committees and have a look at it. And this is the same what I look for me on a nudge. Okay, if a nudge, after having what is a consensus in the society been established standard of transparency doesn't work anymore, matching it, be it like that. That's for me what the value of democracy. Otherwise, there's no discussion on that.
Or Margot?
So I also want to follow up on the question of transparency. And the last comment and from the panel and Professor Engel, I got this sense initially listening to the discussion of transparency that there is a particular problem with respect to nudges in the transparency, from a transparency perspective. And I think this came from your comments, Benedikt, and Professor Engel as well, and I'm not entirely sure that that is the case. So while I agree that transparency is very important, I want to suggest that this might be an issue also for interventions that we do not consider as nudges. And so it seems like, and I think Professor Engel made this point, that if we're talking about incentives like taxes or fines, prohibitions, we have to be transparent. It's inherently part of the idea of these regulatory tools, because they would not work if we do not know what the incentive is, what we're incentivizing or what we're punishing against. And this might not be true for nudges. So I want to kind of challenge this on both directions. So first of all, as the kind of last comment suggested, there are some nudges where transparency is necessary, like warnings, in the same way. And on the other side of this issue, there are certain arguments, for example, that even when we're talking about incentives, maybe if we want to be more effective, we don't want to be transparent. So for example, there is an argument to be made with respect to the incentives to comply with the tax laws that actually we should not be very transparent and clear about the probability of a tax audit. Because if people knew that it was so low, there would be much more of tax evasion that we currently have. So maybe it's good that we're not entirely transparent about the probability of tax audits. Maybe we want to kind of take advantage of lesser transparency. So the argument here is that transparency, of course, is important, but I'm not sure that there is a kind of an inherent difference between nudging and other non-nudge type policies in kind of susceptibility to transparency type critiques. Kind of the last kind of minor comment that I want to make here is with respect to kind of the feasibility of transparency as such. When we're talking about very complex issues, and we're going to talk later today about, say, financial products or other types of very complicated decisions, transparency is an admirable goal, but it's very difficult to make everything transparent. And no, Sabrina talked about kind of the complexity of these decisions. It's just very hard, maybe impossible to be completely transparent. And even then, we have these kind of trade-offs and choices that we inevitably have to make about what information is more salient and less salient.
Okay, great. So this was a terrific set of papers. So just in case it's helpful, I think there are three distinctions that emerged from at least two of the papers, and maybe all three. The first is paternalistic nudges versus externality-reducing nudges, and that's probably a very important distinction to keep in mind. I sense the ethical concerns are weakened for externality-reducing nudges, and that's just a set of policy interventions that need empirical investigation. The second distinction is between educative nudges and, let's just call them, uneducative nudges, where Sabrina is skeptical of the uneducative nudges and wants a presumption in favor of the educative, and that might be right. And a third distinction, which was also, I think, in Sabrina's paper, is between bias-centered nudges and let's just call them not bias-centered nudges, where the empirical challenge, and there's also an ethical component, is that the bias-centered nudges might have a weaker empirical base than some think and might also run into objections from the standpoint of paternalism. So those are maybe three useful distinctions to keep in mind. And my question really is about the first paper. The most contentious set of nudges would be those that are paternalistic, non-educative, and bias-centered. So bite the bullet and take all three. And I gather the suggestion from the first paper was that the only available justification for those, at least, has to do with collective self-binding from Brennan and co-author. And I just want to raise a question about that. You could imagine in the context of worker safety, the example you raised, could ask whether collective self-binding is a sufficient justification. So suppose a democratic polity decides to have worker safety rules that bind workers to avoid unsafe workplaces. You might wonder whether workers are actually engaged in that form of self-binding. Are they responsible for the law in question? And even if they are, we might think that if the incidence of costs and benefits isn't helpful to workers as a class, the fact that there is a fact that is collective self-binding might not be a sufficient justification. So I'm trying to urge a John Stuart Mill-like objection from the first half of your first slide against collective self-binding as an adequate justification, and to argue instead that we ought to be engaging in either an autonomy or a welfare-based analysis of that problem. And then the question is whether, if that's convincing, whether the first half of the first slide isn't also vulnerable on welfarist grounds. So the claim would be, even if you don't have collective self-binding, if you have some strong welfarist reason for the paternalistic intervention, whether it ought not to be accepted because you have the strong welfarist justification. So let's take two contentious examples. Suppose either through law or through private practice, once a smoker goes to a doctor and the doctor says, "Are you a smoker?" If the answer is yes, I am a smoker, the doctor automatically enrolls the person in a smoking cessation program, subject to opt-out. If we have a welfarist justification, that is thousands and maybe tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of lives can be saved by that default rule, wouldn't that be justified, even if there isn't any kind of collective self-binding? And a second example is automatic enrollment in a wellness program from a public employer. who says, you're just in a wellness program, you work here, congratulations. And the worker can opt out if they think, I hate this wellness program, but they're automatically enrolled. Question is, do you really need a collective self-binding justification, or is it not enough if you have a strong welfarist justification?
Okay. I'm highly skeptical about welfarist justifications because you have the assumption that you can have interpersonal comparison of utilities. And we don't have a scientific basis for this. And if you don't have this, you make cost-benefit analysis, but there you do not count utilities, but abilities to pay. And rich people are willing to spend more than poor people. So if you take a purely utilitarian framework with identical marginal utility, you might come to a totally different social conclusions as with traditional cost-benefit analysis. Insofar, I'm highly skeptical about these welfarist comparisons because I cannot trade the utility of one person against the utility of other persons. I think since Pareto we know this, and as economists and also lawyers, we always fall into the trap that we just forget this and are just thinking of money as a measure of utility, and that's effectively not the case, at least as long as we assume that we have decreasing marginal utility of income. Insofar, I do not accept this. And then I stick to the point that the only justification I know is this collective self-binding. I do not say that that justifies all measures, but I think this is the only. There's, of course, if you like, a philosophical tradition where you can make a thought experiment whether we should impose such a measure or not, and then we have to go back to the original position of Rawls or the constitutional situation of Jim Buchanan and ask whether under the information restrictions which are in the original position, rational people would decide on this measure or not. I think this is a possibility of justification. There we avoid all these welfarist problems, and it can be a strong argument in the political process. But finally, we have to decide politically on this, and not with welfare calculations.
Mr. McCrudden? Yeah, Mr. McCrudden. Whatever.
Sorry. I wasn't sure whether to ask this question, but the photographer said that I'll be the first female to ask a question. So he encouraged me to do that. I'm not sure whether there was a point about gender equality or he just needs a wider mix of pictures, but there you go. So I'm Christine Erter from the Financial Conduct Authority. I mean, this is purely a personal question. A lot of the talks I heard yesterday and today basically try to sell us the nudges, and they give really good intuitive examples where you just say, well, obviously, but we would want that, right? I mean, who would disagree? But I was just wondering whether it's sort of distracting our attention a bit from the really difficult methodological questions about how to, going back to Aaron Bardjill's point, how to actually be transparent about these sorts of interventions and how to discuss their effects with the society. Because I'm quite surprised that there is so much take-up of the default auto-enrollment rule, which effectively actually only works if you don't pay attention to it, and if you did actually force people to make an active choice because of this trade-off between your future self and your current self, you probably would opt out, or there are actually a lot of other hidden questions about how much you actually contribute to your pension, and is 7% the right thing, 11% the right thing? It doesn't feel like, for me as someone who is contributing such a pension, that these have actually been explored much. So I have a question about, well, who should take responsibility for designing this methodology or framework, saying, well, when you assess these sorts of defaults or nudges, these are the sort of things you have to assess, whether it's asking consumers about what they want or doing experiments or whatever, because often governments will have an incentive to sell the policy, and they not only want to protect you from from yourself, they also have this point about this impact on the state in the future if you don't have enough pension contributions, and that has to come out of taxes. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want to, Sabrina? I think it's a good point also relating to what Konstantin was saying, that the objectives are not always that clear or that separable, in the sense that there might be third-party involvement in some way in the nudges too that you're pointing to. So it's not clear whether it's just welfarist, or just paternalistic. Mr. Beckram, yeah.
So I wanted to try to respond a little to the question that Professor Engel was raising, which I think remains a central issue for the rest of the discussion in the next few days as well. So far this morning, there seem to have been two kinds of justifications raised for controversial nudges. One is the collective self-binding argument, and the other is the welfarist approach. And I'm wondering whether we really, at this point, need to insert some more kinds of justifications. And the example that seems to me to be troubling for both kinds of explanations would be, for example, where Parliament, I come, of course, now from the example of the elected dictatorship that was mentioned earlier on, that Parliament decides, as an act of collective self-binding, to authorize subliminal advertising. So advertising which directly uses the fact that you cannot fully understand the effect of the advertising in order to create a particular set of behaviors. So this is obviously an extreme example, but bear with me for the moment. So let's say Parliament decides that, and decides it in a situation where the welfarist argument wins out. It's done for an extremely good reason, to save millions of people lives or to better their lives. Neither the welfarist argument nor, I think, the collective self-binding argument would, at least to me, be persuasive in order to justify this act of subliminal advertising being accepted. So if I'm right that my intuition is shared by others, that would be unacceptable, then we need some other sort of set of justifications, which of course brings us to the constitutional questions, where welfarism and collective self-binding does not exhaust the list of kinds of justifications that we need. So what worried me a little about the discussion last night, after reading Cass Sunstein's book, was that I understood, and he'll correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, that his notion of the other kinds of justifications that might be in play, like autonomy, are simply welfarism dressed up in another way. In other words, that everything reduces to welfare. So I'm wondering really what other kinds of justifications we need to introduce that aren't welfarist and that aren't collective self-binding. Thank you.
Do you want to come in?
Happy to. So thank you for that. So I have no microphone, which is probably good. I think we might want to distinguish between justifications for government action and prohibitions on government action. These are separate points. And in the case of subliminal advertising, there's a welfarist justification. The question is whether it isn't subject to override. And I agree with you that it's subject to override. There's an anti-manipulation principle, which I think is the right principle, which is a trump card in the case you gave against the action in question. I think probably there's consensus in the room, if I picked up on the three discussions, that there wouldn't be a convincing account, at least on the consensus in the room, that would reduce all values to a welfarist one. So there is an autonomy tradition in multiple nations that are represented here, including the elected non-dictatorship that is the United Kingdom, and the autonomy norm is independent of the welfarist norm. And the anti-manipulation principle is connected with Kant and not Bentham.
Herr Kirchgässner?
Okay, if you don't have no welfarist justification and now collective self-binding justification, you still have, as I mentioned, the possibility to ask what people in the original position would decide on, and you can use this as an argument. But finally, you have to politically decide and to politically justify. And there, of course, I would always prefer to have a direct democracy and not a purely representative system, because in our direct democracy, if people have to decide on this, then there is a public discussion about this, there is transparency, there are the arguments brought up from both sides, and insofar, then, of course, you have to accept what people decide, even if you're not in line with this. But I think this is a constitutional rule which can help you quite a lot in the direction you are thinking.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Jeff King. I'm from University College London, and I wanted to address the topic of manipulation and to offer some thoughts on how you can defend nudging against a charge of manipulation. So first of all, it's an ambiguous concept, and I don't know if it should fall on advocates of nudging to give it greater definitional content. Perhaps the critics who raise the objection should be clear about what exactly manipulation is. But nonetheless, here are a couple of candidates for what I think it could be. So one is that we could say that manipulation is using deception to get people to make decisions unknowingly. That's one possibility. Another is it's using deception to get people to make decisions that they don't want to make. Now, I think the second form is not what nudging does. It's not forcing people to make decisions they don't want to make. It's arguably getting them to make decisions unknowingly. And is that a problem? Well, the real issue is it's deceptive. And there can be two different kinds of deception. One is active deception, where you actually cloud reality. You try to hide something. I don't think any of the nudging proposals are doing that. But another type of deception might be passive deception, where you're exploiting a weakness, you're exploiting lack of information, indecision or something like that. Some may argue that that is one type of manipulation that nudging involves. Now, I think the answer to this kind of charge, that it's deceptive in this way, is quite simple. You just use disclosure. I don't think that most regimes are too difficult to use disclosure. For instance, in taxes, tax forms, for instance, will often have pages saying, be sure to draw your attention to the following sections of this tax form, which are extremely important. I think when you have a nudged choice architecture, it's fairly easy to say, here are the default rules that we have set. Here's a short account of the reasoning that we've used to set these default rules. This has already been proposed. I think that is a complete answer to the charge of manipulation in nudging. But I just wanted to make one other point, which is one way in which nudging can be manipulative is where there's already an established practice of presenting a choice architecture. And by introducing a nudge, you depart from that established practice. I think that requires special justification. But again, this type of disclosure can provide that justification. Thanks.
Hans-Michael Heinig.
Michael Heinig, Uni Göttingen. First, I have to apologize for my poor English skills. My Latin was always better than my English, but I think I should try English. Okay. I still struggle with the question of colleague Engel, and I'm not sure how we can deal it. I would like to suggest that we have always three distinctions in mind, and Kes Sunstein talked about some of this distinction also. First distinction is that there is a difference between governmental nudging and nudging in the private sector, which is really essential when we think about these problems in a perspective of normative theory of law. The second distinction is between nudges with the intention of influencing persons and the unavoidable choice architecture. And the third distinction is between paternalistic nudges and non-paternalistic nudges. And I must admit, I'm mostly interested in theoretical questions, even after the last talk of Kes Hanstein, who said, this is always a trap, but let me fall into this trap. I see the nudge, but I jump about it. I'm mostly interested in the governmental, intentional, and paternalistic nudges, and I think they are the main problems in the perspective of normative theory. So if we talk about governmental nudges, they are just confronted with the demands of democratic legitimacy, and we are in a discourse we know a lot about, and we can talk a lot about it. What is demanded in question of in a democratic society when the government wants to interfere. The second distinction was the intentional governmental nudge. And, well, we are not really sure which nudge here is relevant for the scope of human rights. I think in the language game of the German human rights doctrine, we talk a lot about this under the topic Eingriff in einen Schutzbereich, and we can learn a lot about how to deal with these problems in this sense. When is it relevant for the concepts of autonomy, of liberty, of freedom? If we reflect the answers we already found there in this doctrinal scholarship. And there may be a couple of points for justification if we agree that there is what we call Eingriff in einen Schutzbereich, for example, transparency, costs, benefits, welfare effects, and we can talk a lot about this. And the most problematic nudge seems to me the paternalistic governmental nudge. Is it allowed? Under which circumstances? And I will talk more about this on Wednesday, so I stop here.
Thank you. So we have one question coming from the internet. Ms. Birkenkötter, would you like?
Thank you. Well, this is it's more of a comment really that was made to the presentation by Benedikt Herrmann from Elliot Bulmer, who works at the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance in The Hague. And well, his comment or his fear is that at the root of both nudging and Benthamism is sort of a behavioralist view of human nature that denies agency and free will. So he argues that in this view, we don't make moral choices, but we respond to stimuli. And in a way, nudging is about changing those stimuli, but without giving people much opportunity to discuss what is meant by the good. So we try to change the stimuli for the good without giving room for a discussion about what the good is. I believe part of that comment has been responded to by the discussion about transparency, yet because it is a comment that came in from an audience from abroad, I did want to introduce that. He continues to say that he has a concern that the politics, in a way, is squeezed out of this conception of nudging, yet he concedes that he might be wrong, that he's coming from a different place, and that he's not necessarily opposed to all of the insights of nudging, but he would like to know more perhaps about the motives that are behind nudging, especially potentially when it comes from a public agent. Thank you.
Benedikt, do you want to?
Yeah, it's just wondering. Firstly, I think we covered most of it really with the transparency discussion. I personally this is my personal deep conviction. I deeply believe in the existence of the human free will, and I would never go for interpret myself or other species, other fellows of my species of just of kind of incentive automatic machine which reply to something. Having said this, is it really is this maybe a too strong interpretation that we don't give people the possibility to make a informed choice? I mean, this was all this. I thought much of the discussion here was also about your call for educating, exactly providing more information. This seems to me absolutely clear, and I think so that you provide an additional information context, that there can be a proper decision can be done. I mean, nudging is not excluding that. I think rather the opposite, rather calling for it. I mean, so I'm not so sure whether this would be the right way to frame it, that people then kind of would have to make choices without fully understanding the whole choice set or what these implications are. And I think this regarding, was there anything else we should additionally discuss here? I mean, the last question regarding what is the special interest or benefit for the policymaker? I mean, this has been raised several times, that of course it's kind of the hope that the policymaker would meet the needs of the citizen in a friendlier way, in a more citizen-friendly way. This is, I think, at the end of the day, is kind of the major hope. I mean, there's nothing else what could drive a policymaker to go for this.
Yes. I think it would be unfair in the light of the theory of nudging and choice architectures to say it would just be changing stimuli and just reactions to stimuli. I think it's not in line with the literature, the vast literature on these topics. Anne-Kathrin Kaufhold?
Thank you. My name is Anne-Kathrin Kaufhold from University of Freiburg. As for my English, I wish I could say my Latin has always been better. I'd like to come back to the question of justification, and I want to ask, why do we need a specific justification for nudges? What is so characteristic and specific about nudges that we cannot use the justifications that we usually use for regulatory tools? What makes it so different from any other regulatory tool, and why can we not rely upon the discussions that we've been had for at least a couple of 100 years?
Yes.
It's not a justification for nudges in particular, it's a justification for paternalistic measures. And for normal government interventions, we have the interest of third parties, and this is a totally different case where you intervene into individual decisions because you or somebody knows better than these individuals what is in their long-run interest. And this is a different situation than if you have to take account of third interests, which are affected by the actions of these agents.
So we have room for one last question, for one concise last question. Yes, Isabel Fragner.
Maybe to follow up on this comment or question. So I'm thinking about the 401k retirement question and the question whether the government should intervene in order to facilitate a better choice. So in a system where we don't have privatized markets for retirement, we wouldn't even think about paternalism in relation to the question of pensions. But once we have privatized this area, then the government intervening in order to facilitate better choice somehow becomes a question of paternalism. So I wonder if we don't have to really take the political economy context more into account when we talk about nudging and what it does and which justifications are required.
If you don't have these private markets and you have a mandatory old age pension system which goes above the subsistence levels, which is a public, then you still have the paternalistic problem. So the problem of paternalism is not restricted to the existence of private markets in this case. What changes if you have private markets in this case, then you have more choices, and then the paternalistic measures might change. But paternalism is in both cases, that's not a problem of private markets in this area.
Well, with that, I thank you all. First of all, the panelists, but also all the discussants on the floor. And we'll have a brief break after these exercises, and there's some academic junk drinks in the back of the room. Thanks a lot.